On a damp night in a nameless little village, the cry of a newborn was the only sign that the world had not completely frozen. Behind a fogged windowpane, an old woman with wrinkled hands sat kneeling on the dirt floor. She was not waiting, not preparing. She was simply used to it. For a midwife in the 17th century, night meant torn bellies, ruptured wombs, and prayers that were never answered. The room was filled with the scent of blood, flesh, and damp charcoal. She wiped sweat from the brow of a young mother, barely 20, then touched the belly that had grown as hard as stone. It had been too long, too quiet. And the midwife knew there are silences more terrifying than screams, more piercing than sobs. She had seen this many times. Sometimes the baby came out without a sound, and the mother followed a few hours later. Sometimes it was the reverse. Sometimes both left and only the midwife remained, carrying blood-soaked cloths in silence that clung to her skin like a curse. She did not cry. Not anymore. Not for many years. For in this world, tears were a luxury. She knew her body was small, her voice soft, and she had never learned to read. But she knew more about life and death than any preacher who gave sermons or nobleman who ruled. She knew what a dying face looked like. She could hear it in the last breath, sense it in the shift from hope to surrender. She knew the taste of warm blood. She knew that each time something was born, something else was lost. Love, or time, or life. No one recorded her name. No one gave her thanks. She came from the dark, worked in the dark, and returned to it. She walked home through the mud, sometimes carrying cloth still wet with things no one wanted to remember. But she kept coming when called, knocking softly, bowing slightly, and whispering, "I am here." Sometimes the husband would scold her if the wife did not survive. Sometimes the mother would scratch her face if the baby came out breathless. But there were no other choices. There were no hospitals. No doctors, only her and the silent prayers she muttered as small hands touched this cruel world for the first time. That night, the baby was finally born, but its eyes did not open, and its skin was cold like earth, unkissed by the sun. The young mother cried softly, then stopped. There was no hysteria, only silence heavier than a gravestone. The midwife wrapped the baby in old cloth, then said nothing. She only stared at the dim candlelight and knew that the day would repeat again, and again, and again, until one day she would not wake up either. But before that, there would be hundreds of cries, and even more silences. She knew, because she was not just a midwife. She was the guardian of the threshold between two worlds. And sometimes, no one stood there but her. There is a silence known only to women who have waited for life and were greeted instead by death. The midwife called it the Black Quiet. It was not just loneliness nor sorrow. It was a kind of emptiness that sat in corners, peeked through doorways, and whispered in her ear when the world no longer turned its head. In daylight, she would go to the fields, pretending to be part of normal village life. But night always brought her back to wounds that never healed, even if they were invisible. She once tried planting flowers in her yard, hoping color could chase away the weight on her shoulders. but the flowers died. Whether from cold soil or hands that had held too much blood, she never knew. People respected her, but from a distance. No one truly spoke to her at length. No one asked about her dreams, because everyone understood that being a midwife was not a job, but a fate. She had never chosen it, since she was a teenager. After her own mother died giving birth to a brother who never cried, people began pointing at her. "You have small hands," they said. "You can save lives." But no one taught her anything. She learned from corpses, from mistakes, from nights when a single slow movement meant losing 2 lives. And slowly she became part of a cycle with no end. Sometimes, in half sleep, she dreamed of babies who never arrived. Their voices did not scream, only called softly, as if asking why. And she had no answer. She knew she could not save them all. But still, each time she failed, a part of her soul died with them. There were houses she no longer visited because the memories looked at her from between the bed slats. There were voices she avoided because they sounded like mothers who had screamed upon finding their babies turning blue. And sometimes she just sat alone in the kitchen, holding an empty cup, pretending there was still something left to warm. She often thought about how the world saw birth as a miracle. But for her, that miracle always came wrapped in blood and fear. She knew how fragile life was, how thin the veil between first breath and last. She had no time to be grateful, because before one cry faded, another door was being knocked on with panic. "Midwife," they said, "hurry, my wife is bleeding. My child is not moving." She ran barefoot even when her knees ached and her eyes barely opened. And when she arrived, there was no welcome. Only a dark room, a pale woman, and a cry that may never come. She lived in the pause, in the space between life and death, in a place where no praise and no anger could linger long. Because everything was temporary. Every night was a trial. Every morning was forgetfulness. The world moved on without seeing her, without asking if she was still strong, still breathing, still believing that a first cry was a victory. But she still came. Because even if no one remembered her, she knew that in the moment when a single breath entered this world, she was standing at the doorway of fate. And as always, she knocked softly, then entered. Sometimes the night led her to houses that were far too quiet, where the husband had died in war and only a young mother lay alone, clutching her belly with trembling hands. The house smelled of old smoke and rotting bark. The oil lamp flickered weakly, nearly extinguished, like a soul only half alive. In a corner of the room, there was a straw doll left behind by the previous child, a child who never returned from fever. And there she sat, the midwife, as calm as a ghost. She spoke little because words could not stitch a torn womb or call back a departed spirit. She only listened. Listened to broken breathing. Listened to a body shifting slowly. Listened to time evaporating like frost in the morning cold. And in moments like this, she always felt something she couldn't explain, a kind of sadness that didn't come from herself, but from the place. As if the house stored wounds in its walls, in its floor, in the sound of its creaking door. as if the building remembered every birth and death that had ever occurred inside. Sometimes she wanted to scream just to shatter that silence. But she knew if she screamed, the house would collapse. She kept the quiet with a kind of reverence only understood by those who lived alongside loss. She knew that pain without sound cut deeper than any cry. She knew that not all suffering wants to be seen. That night, the young mother gave birth without her husband, without her mother, without anyone but the midwife. Blood dripped like light rain from the straw bed. The midwife's hands moved quickly, though her joints ached. The baby was born alive, crying faintly. But the mother did not respond. She simply stared at the ceiling, her eyes vacant. And amid the newborn's cries, there was a silence louder than any bell. The midwife knew. The woman's body was alive, but her soul might not return. And there, her duty was not only to greet the child, but to keep the mother's soul from slipping away. She sat beside her all night, without sleep, holding her cold hand, whispering phrases she wasn't even sure she believed. Because being a midwife wasn't just about birth. Sometimes she had to dig small graves in the morning when the baby didn't survive and no one else would bury it. Sometimes she had to stand in another woman's kitchen, cooking porridge for a mother too weak to rise. Sometimes she was just a witness to lives so brief, like candle flames blown out by the wind. There were no medals, no celebrations, only bloodstains on the hem of her dress and hands that trembled every night before sleep. She knew if she stopped, no one would replace her. No one else would come at 2 a.m. with water and towels, with cold hands and a heart still strong. She lived in the shadows, in a stretch of time that went unrecorded. But every baby that grew, every mother who survived, was proof she had been there. That even in silence, even without a name, she was a small beam holding up the world. And in that silence, she found meaning. Not from praise, but from endurance. From returning home each morning with a tired body and a soul that never truly healed. But she knew there would be another night, another cry, another house that would knock on her fate. Winter was an invisible enemy. It didn't arrive with a sound, but crept into bones, into breath, and into lives not yet fully formed. When the first snow fell, the women of the village began counting months with quiet fear. They knew a child born in cold might never cry. And among thin blankets, swelling bellies, and kitchens without firewood, they all turned to one figure: the midwife. She came with an old basket filled with salt water, flax thread, and linen no longer white. But it wasn't her tools that brought calm. It was her presence, silent, weary, but certain. She was the shape of devotion that needed no explanation. That day, snow was knee-deep. Her small steps whispered softly between the frozen trees. The house she approached leaned crooked on a hillside, its roof leaking, its door rotting. But inside, a woman trembled and groaned, and time would not wait. There was no turning back, only forward, no matter the unspoken risks. The midwife said little. She unwrapped the bandages, rolled up her sleeves, and sat beside the straw bed. She knew this body would bleed. She knew these seconds might be the mother's last, but there was no room for panic. She was there to serve her role as the gatekeeper between life and end. The mother's body convulsed in waves of unending pain. Her teeth chattered, her hands clawed the air, and blood pooled beneath her. No doctor, no miracle herbs. Just one old woman and prayers too quiet to voice. But the midwife remained, wiping sweat, guiding breaths, tying the cord with her cold hands. The baby came out silent, didn't cry. Its face was bluish, like a statue carved from night. Seconds froze. The world paused to ask one question: life or death? She didn't give up. She shook the child gently, pressed it to the mother's chest, patted its back carefully. And when a faint cry finally broke through, she didn't cry herself, didn't smile. She simply nodded slowly, as if acknowledging that this time the miracle had not abandoned her. But the mother had fainted, and her work wasn't done. She cleaned the blood, wrapped the wounds, covered the trembling body. All of it done in silence, like a sacred ritual never taught, only passed down from woman to woman. She didn't know if the mother would live until the ice melted, but that night she had done what a human being could do. Outside, the wind still pierced, but she didn't feel the cold. Her hands still held a strange warmth, not from fire, but from new life. As she walked home, her shadow disappeared into the fog. No one saw. No one welcomed her. But she knew somewhere the world now held one more cry. And in her heart, she carried a small hope that the baby would live long enough to forget this night, and the mother strong enough to tell it. She asked for no reward. She only wanted them not to forget that someone once sat on a cold floor and refused to give up to the dark. Not every night ended with the cry of a baby. Some long nights left only the smell of blood, a woman's voiceless grief, and a tiny still body. On nights like these, time turned to mud, sticky, slow, and directionless. The midwife would sit for a long while, staring at a baby's face that never got to know the world. She looked at the blue-tinged little fingers, the eyes that never opened, the skin still warm, as if the world delayed goodbye by just one more second. She didn't cry. She couldn't cry. Because if she cried for every baby who died, she would never stop crying. She simply breathed slowly, held that little body close, and wrapped it in the softest linen she had. Not because the baby would feel comfort, but because she wanted the world to know that this life, too, deserved dignity. She never threw away a baby's body. She buried them herself in soft earth behind the house, near wildflowers, or beneath the old apple tree. She spoke silent words, not taught by scripture, but born from wounds that never healed. Because the midwife knew, the earth never rejects. The soil always welcomes what the heavens deny. But that night was different. The mother screamed after the silence, not from pain, but because she knew. She knew the baby didn't cry. She felt an emptiness that could not be repaired. She grabbed the midwife's arm, clutched it hard, and asked why. But there was no answer. Fate held no logic. There was no explanation that could soothe grief. The midwife simply bowed her head, letting the frail hand scratch her wrist. She didn't defend herself. She stayed still. Because in that stillness, she was saying, I lost something too. I don't understand either. I can only be here, with you, until morning comes and the world pretends to forget. As dawn rose, the midwife stood slowly. She offered no comfort, because there were no words to fill the hollow in the mother's chest. She left a small cloth upon the mother's chest, a prayer woven from thread. She stepped out of the house, her body heavy, but her steps sure. The road home was empty, but she wasn't alone. In her mind, the names of babies who never became people lined up neatly. She remembered them all, not with photos, not with stone carvings, but with a feeling that lived in her heart. She knew she would deliver again next week or the next night. But she also knew not all would live, and she had to be ready for that. Again and again. Her life was a blanket of time, fraying at the edges. She kept stitching it, though new holes always appeared. She didn't seek a happy ending. She only wanted to make the world slightly softer, if only for a few hours. And that was enough. She believed her presence wasn't to save every life, but to offer comfort to those left behind. To be the one hand that remained when all other hands withdrew. And though she knew that one day her own body would die alone, she held on to one hope, that there would be another midwife. On another cold night, sitting like her, silent, steady, and quietly loving in the dark. People only knew her when they needed her, when belly swelled, when water broke, when the night felt like a bottomless pit. But once the baby cried and morning came, she was often forgotten. No invitations to feasts, no front row in church. Even when she walked to the market with slow steps, people only nodded slightly, half in respect, half in fear, because she carried the scent of life and death. She was the silent witness to things no one wanted to remember. She touched the border between womb and grave too often that some believed her touch brought misfortune. She didn't explain, didn't deny, because she knew the world preferred fairy tales. The world wanted to believe every baby was born with joyful cries, every mother survived, and every family stayed whole. But she held stories that would never be told. Of women giving birth in chicken coops because they were rejected by their families. Of young girls hidden away because of shame. Of blood that flowed too much, too fast, with no one left to say goodbye. She carried their secrets, not as burdens, but as honors. Because being a midwife wasn't a job. It was a silent vow to be the keeper of unspoken sorrows. Behind the crooked door of her house, she kept everything ever used. Small scissors, glass bottles for herbs, handwritten notes from trembling fingers. On the wall hung baby clothes never worn, gifts never claimed, and thank you letters from hands now lost to time. She didn't reread those letters. She only touched them sometimes, the way one touches a gravestone. Not to bring back life, but to remember she was once needed. That in this vast world, there were small moments when her presence made a difference. Sometimes at night, she woke drenched in cold sweat. Not from nightmares, but from hearing a cry that wasn't there. Her body remembered seconds that were too silent. She sat up, hugging her knees, letting time pass. No one came, no one knocked. But she stayed, as always. An old woman, body tired, hands full of stories that couldn't be written. And when the rooster crowed, she rose again. Because life didn't wait. And who knows, maybe tonight another door would knock. Another mother would need a hand that understands. And another baby would be waiting at the edge of a first breath. On market days, when church bells rang and the village streets grew busy, the midwife still walked alone, weaving through laughter and trade. She didn't carry a basket full of fresh fruits or beautifully woven cloth. Just a small pouch of herbs and steps arranged from silence. Some children looked at her with curiosity tinged with fear. They had heard she could help births without blood, but also that she might bring death with a quiet prayer. As if the world didn't understand, she was just a human. One who stood too often at the threshold between arrival and departure. She bought onions and a bundle of herbs, not for cooking, but for healing. Because the body after birth is not a gentle tale. Its wounds and tears stitched together with patience. She chose dried flowers and bark to make balms that softened pain. No apothecary, no laboratory, just memory and instinct. She memorized the scent of wounds and the shade of blood. She could distinguish between the smell of life and the one slowly turning into death. Inside her, there was a map of the human body, never drawn, but always read, through hands, eyes, and the tremble of a patient's final breath. While standing by a vegetable cart, someone greeted her. A young mother with a plump baby in her arms. Her smile was soft, and she offered a small apple as thanks. The midwife accepted it, but said little. She only nodded, her eyes slightly glassy. She remembered that night. The mother had barely survived. Blood had flowed like a narrow stream, and breath had clung on like a whisper at the door. But now the woman lived, and her child too. And though there was no celebration or hymns in the midwife's eyes, it was a silent miracle, a coincidence given a name: survival. After that, she walked home with the apple in hand and eyes older than her body. Along the way, birds chirped as usual, but to her, the world always seemed a bit dim, like a painting left unfinished. She never truly laughed, but she never hated life either. She simply kept walking, in a silence she knew like an old friend. And in that silence, she understood. If not her, then who would guard the threshold between birth and death? Who else would sit among blood and tears just to make sure the world kept turning? The world needed unknown heroes, and she was one of them. She was once young, and in her youth, she too had fallen in love. A man from the city, bringing stories of books and stars and hands as soft as if they had never touched muddy fields. They exchanged dreams beneath an old tree, making promises in words too sweet for a world this hard. But life does not always make room for promises. When the man left to study medicine, he vowed to return. But the last letter said he now lived in a distant place, married a woman from a more respected family, and had a healthy child. No apologies, no questions. It's just a long pause, like someone pulling down the curtain of night too quickly. The midwife did not cry when she read the letter. She simply placed it beneath a small stone near the tree where they once sat. Rain soaked it over the years, and the letters faded like memories one no longer wishes to recall. From that moment on, she made no room in her heart for anything that could be lost. She chose crying babies and exhausted mothers as her focus, not because she didn't want to be loved, but because she knew love often arrives with departure, and loss feels sharper than never having anything at all. She passed long nights alone, with a small candle flickering and the slow ticking of a clock. Sometimes she reread the birth records she had written by hand. Strange names, scattered dates. Some babies survived, some didn't. But she recorded them all neatly, as if proving she had once been there. That she had helped life arrive, even if sometimes it failed. She blamed no one, not even herself. She only knew that even the sun could not shine everywhere at once. In the quiet corner of her heart, she held a question. Who would ever write her name? Who would remember her old hands that had once helped tens, hundreds, maybe thousands of lives into this world? No portraits, no grand tombstone, no history book would mention her. But she demanded nothing. She only hoped that maybe one day, in a place she never knew, a woman might whisper thanks in a quiet prayer. Because life is a circle, often unseen, but always connected. And midwives like her are the silent knots that keep it turning. Sometimes, when the sky was overcast and the wind rattled the door like a whispering moan, the midwife felt her small house wasn't entirely empty. She never believed in ghosts, but there were nights when the air felt too heavy to explain with logic. As if another breath drifted behind the curtains, as if small footsteps never quite arrived. She wasn't afraid, just quiet, because perhaps, she thought, these were the sounds of babies who never had the chance to cry. Sounds that never became screams, but still carried a longing to be heard. The small candles she lit before sleep sometimes flickered on their own, as if disturbed by memory. She kept a piece of cloth from the first child who died in her arms. Its faded pink hue and frayed edges bore witness to time. But she kept it not as horror, but as a reminder that in this harsh world, even the earliest loss deserved remembrance. Sometimes she spoke to them, to those who never stayed in the world. She would share village news, mention new names born, and ask gently if they felt peace wherever they now were. But not all loss came from babies. There were mothers who left too soon, wives who never saw their child's face. There were screams she never forgot, even after decades. And the midwife knew that not all deaths arrived with peace. Some came like black fog, sudden, unavoidable, leaving silent holes in hearts that could never be filled. She once watched a man clutch his wife's lifeless body, begging for a miracle. But the body stayed cold, and the baby in her arms cried louder than the rain outside. There was no magic, no salvation, just the truth that sometimes life chooses who must leave without a reason that makes sense. The midwife held all of this in her chest, like a book she never wrote. She knew too much. She understood too deeply. But no one asked, and no one truly wanted to know. So she stayed quiet. She became the keeper of others' wounds, letting her own grow without sound. The world only saw an old woman walking slowly with a small basket. No one knew that inside her, life and death had shaken hands 1,000 times. That she had closed more eyes than she had opened. That those trembling hands were once a bridge between this world and something no words could name. One cold morning, a little child knocked on her door. Tiny hands held a basket of apples, and a shy smile peeked out. Behind him stood a young woman with a face that felt familiar. She introduced herself, naming her mother, the one the midwife had once helped give birth. The child, she said, was the baby born on that cold night, with candles nearly out and a mother's voice fading. Now, the child had come to say thank you. No grand words. Just a basket of fruit and a small hug that made the midwife's chest tighten with a feeling too deep for a name. That day, she did not write anything down. She didn't open old papers or check her basket's contents. She simply sat by the window, watching the sunlight break through glass and fall onto the wooden floor like a silent prayer. She recalled every cry, every drop of blood, every long night she had faced alone. She knew the world might never carve her name in stone or mention her in books. But that day, she felt full, because finally, someone remembered. And in a world so cruel and rushed, one memory alone could heal wounds that spanned years. That night, she went to bed early. No footsteps. No creaking doors. Just breath, slow and light, like fabric floating in air. The house was silent, but not with fear. Silent like a long embrace from a past that had made peace. In her dreams, she walked in a field full of wildflowers. In the distance, babies who never had a chance to live now smiled at her. And mothers she once helped waved with faces young again, free of pain. And when dawn arrived, the windows of her home remained closed. The candle had gone out. But on the table, the basket of apples remained fresh. And in the morning air, there was the scent of damp earth, as if to say something had ended, but not vanished. That love could remain, even after the body had gone. And that in a life so quiet and unknown. Someone like her, a midwife without a grand grave, without statues or songs, could still live on, in the softest, most silent way there ever was.